Imagine waking up next to a man who knows your deepest fears, only to realize he is building a cage for your mind. Modern betrayal does not come from lipstick on a collar. It arrives through pre-filled medical forms and daily vitamins handed over with a warm smile. This is not a broken marriage, but a deadly game of chess. I smiled walking into his trap, just so I could flip the board and bury him. Hello everyone, and thank you sincerely for tuning into Maya Revenge Stories today. Recently, YouTube disabled the monetization feature on our channel, leaving us without the necessary budget to maintain our regular operations. If you find today's story engaging, please kindly support us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel, where you can listen to exclusive real-life stories that are even more incredible and feature much longer runtimes. We describe situations in far greater detail than we are allowed to make public on YouTube, and we use multiple emotional voice actors to bring a single story to life. You can join our community by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link found in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story and step into the life of our main character, Avery Harris. I was 34 years old, working as the lead systems design engineer at Lumina Aerospace, and I truly believed I had constructed a flawless life. I was currently enjoying my first week in a breathtaking modern cabin nestled deep in the Pine Valley Mountains. The house was a stunning architectural marvel of dark timber and vast glass windows, surrounded by ancient towering pine trees. Every single inch of that beautiful property had been purchased entirely with my corporate bonuses and vested stock options. My husband, Julian, a charming and incredibly handsome independent consultant, had contributed nothing to the down payment. His contribution consisted entirely of sweet emotional support, gentle massages after a long day of coding, and telling me how proud he was of my success. It felt like an absolute dream. But exactly on the 7th day after we moved in, that dream began to rot. I was standing in the immaculate open-concept kitchen when my cell phone vibrated against the cool quartz countertop. The caller ID showed the name Arthur Pendleton. He was 68 years old, a retired radio engineer, and the previous owner of the cabin. Since Julian was outside on the back deck, admiring the sunset, I answered the phone with a warm and polite greeting, expecting Arthur to ask about a piece of mail or explain a quirk about the heating system. Instead of a friendly hello, a wave of cold static hissed through the speaker. Then came Arthur's voice. It was trembling, breathless, and filled with a raw, undeniable panic. "Avery, listen to me carefully," he commanded in a harsh whisper. "Do not tell Julian. You need to come to my workshop right now. Come alone." I stood frozen in the middle of my perfect new kitchen. I was completely confused, but my instincts, sharpened by years of identifying fatal flaws in aerospace software, immediately started screaming. There was something terribly, horribly wrong. The sheer terror in that old man's voice was not a joke or a misunderstanding. It was a warning. I hung up the phone and took a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I walked out onto the wooden deck where Julian was leaning against the railing. I forced an exasperated sigh and told him a convincing lie. I said that the main server array at Lumina Aerospace had just experienced a catastrophic crash, and I needed to drive down to the corporate office immediately to fix the issue. Julian turned around, offering me that signature, warm smile that always made my heart flutter. He kissed my cheek, told me not to work too hard, and promised he would keep the house warm for me, for the first time in 3 years. His touch made my skin crawl. I grabbed my keys and drove away from the cabin. The twilight sky quickly dissolved into a thick, creeping mountain fog. Driving through Pine Valley in the dark was an unsettling experience. The heavy mist swallowed the beam of my headlights, making the towering trees look like twisted, shadowy figures watching me from the edge of the asphalt. The silence inside my car was deafening. My mind spun in endless circles, trying to comprehend why Arthur sounded so terrified, and why he had specifically warned me to hide this from the man I loved. It took me about 45 minutes to navigate the treacherous, winding roads to reach Arthur's antique radio workshop. The building sat isolated at the base of the mountain, Surrounded by rusting satellite dishes and discarded electrical equipment, the place was shrouded in darkness, save for a single, flickering amber light burning inside. I parked my car and walked toward the entrance. Before I could even knock, the heavy wooden door was thrown open. Arthur stood there, his face completely drained of color. He looked like a ghost. He frantically checked the empty road behind me, then grabbed my wrist and pulled me inside, immediately locking the heavy iron deadbolt. The air inside the workshop was thick with the smell of burning dust and heated metal. Right in the center of the room, sitting on a cluttered wooden workbench, was a massive, old-fashioned analog radio transceiver. The antique dials were glowing brightly in the dim room, and a low continuous band of static was hissing from the heavy speakers. Arthur did not say a single word of greeting. He simply stood next to the ancient machine, his hands shaking uncontrollably, staring at me with the exact expression of a man who had just witnessed a brutal, cold-blooded crime. Arthur gestured toward a heavy metal stool. I sat down, my eyes fixed on the glowing dials of the ancient radio equipment. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. Arthur swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his wrinkled throat, before he finally broke the agonizing silence. "When I built that cabin up in the mountains," he began, his voice hoarse and defensive, "my wife was already very sick. She was bedridden for the last 2 years of her life. To keep her safe, I installed a closed-circuit, secure analog radio intercom system throughout the entire property. It allowed me to hear her from anywhere, even if I was chopping wood outside. After she passed away, I ripped out all the speakers and microphones, but I forgot about the master transmitter unit. I had sealed it deep inside the stone masonry of the living room chimney for insulation." He placed a trembling hand on a large rectangular tape recorder hooked up to the transceiver. "Yesterday morning, I was recalibrating this old receiver here in the shop," Arthur continued, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I accidentally caught the exact frequency of that forgotten chimney transmitter. It was still broadcasting. I heard voices. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. But then I recognized your husband. I hit record. Avery, you need to brace yourself." Arthur pressed a chunky plastic button on the machine. A harsh mechanical click echoed through the room, followed by the deep hiss of magnetic tape. Then, a voice filled the dusty workshop. It was Julian. But it was not the Julian I knew. The warm, melodic cadence he always used with me was completely gone. His tone on the recording was flat, clinical, and chillingly precise. "The timeline is perfectly on track," Julian's recorded voice stated smoothly. "She swallowed the daily dose this morning without batting an eye. The cognitive deterioration should accelerate significantly over the next 14 days. A woman's voice replied, crisp and authoritative. "Excellent work, darling, but we must be absolutely certain the dosage leaves zero trace in her bloodstream. If the hospital runs a heavy metal toxicology screen, we are entirely ruined." My blood turned to ice. The room started to spin. I knew that woman's voice intimately. It was Beatrice. I paid Beatrice $300 every single Friday for our weekly couples therapy sessions. She was the warm, empathetic professional who had guided Julian and me through the stress of my high-pressure corporate promotions. "Do not worry about the toxicology, my beautiful wife." Julian laughed softly on the tape. My beautiful wife. Those 3 words struck me with the force of a physical blow. The air was violently sucked out of my lungs. I could not breathe. I could not move. "The synthetic compound is flawless," Julian continued, oblivious to the fact that his death sentence was being recorded. "It mimics all the symptoms of early-onset dementia and severe paranoid schizophrenia. By the time we trigger Project Sunset, she will not even remember her own name, let alone how to write a line of code." "And the marriage license?" Beatrice asked, her tone devoid of any of the maternal warmth she displayed in her therapy clinic. "Solid as a rock," Julian replied confidently. "The forgery ring in Nevada did spectacular work. The state of California officially recognizes me as Avery Harris's legal husband. It has been 3 years, and she has never suspected a thing. Once the psychological breakdown reaches its peak, I will enact emergency medical guardianship. I will have full legal authority over her entire estate." Beatrice let out a low, satisfied hum. "That means full control over her Lumina aerospace technology patents. Those are worth tens of millions of dollars. Julian, not to mention the immediate liquidation of that gorgeous new mountain cabin, we are going to be extraordinarily wealthy. And she will be quietly rotting away in a state-funded psychiatric ward, heavily sedated for the rest of her miserable life," Julian added, the cruelty in his voice cutting through the radio static like a serrated knife. "To us." I heard the distinct clinking of two glass tumblers touching together in a toast. Then, Arthur reached out and violently slammed the stop button. Silence crashed back into the workshop. Arthur stared at the floor, too ashamed and horrified to meet my eyes. I remained perfectly still on the metal stool. A normal person might have screamed. A normal woman might have burst into tears, fallen to her knees, or thrown her phone against the brick wall in a fit of hysterical agony. But I did not shed a single tear. The deep, agonizing sorrow of a broken heart was entirely absent. Instead, my mind underwent a terrifyingly rapid transformation. My brain, trained to analyze complex aerospace systems, instantly compartmentalized the trauma. I was no longer a betrayed wife. I was an engineer looking at a catastrophic system failure. Every single memory from the past 3 years flashed through my mind, rapidly recontextualized by this horrifying new data. The way Julian insisted on managing all our paperwork, his polite refusal to merge our bank accounts under the guise of respecting my independence, the subtle, persistent ways he convinced me I was working too hard, making me doubt my own memory whenever I misplaced my keys, and the daily vitamins, the custom-blended, oversized capsules he handed me every morning with a glass of water and a kiss on the forehead. It was not a marriage, it was a meticulously designed, 3-year corporate acquisition strategy. I was not a partner, I was a target. Julian and Beatrice had built an invisible cage around my life, studying my habits, manipulating my environment, and slowly poisoning my nervous system to steal everything I had built with my own hands. The love was a lie. The therapy was a lie. The marriage certificate tucked inside my fireproof safe was a piece of worthless paper. A strange, suffocating calmness washed over me. It was the kind of absolute, 0-degree coldness that exists only in the vacuum of deep space. I looked at the tape deck, then up at Arthur. My facial muscles felt tight, rigid, almost robotic. I knew exactly what they were trying to do to me. They wanted to break my mind. They wanted me to lose my grip on reality. But Julian had made one fatal miscalculation. He had forgotten that I built systems designed to survive atmospheric re-entry and catastrophic orbital failures. I did not break under pressure. I adapted, I optimized, and I eradicated the anomaly. I stood up from the stool, my spine completely straight. The fear was gone, replaced by a dark, consuming void of calculated rage. I had walked straight into a slaughterhouse, completely blind. But now, my eyes were wide open. The drive back from the antique radio workshop was an exercise in extreme psychological dissociation. I gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly my fingers went numb, repeating a single, clinical command in my head over and over again. Do not react. Do not show them the glitch in the system. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway of our magnificent mountain cabin, the exterior security lights bathed the dark timber in a warm, inviting glow. Just a few hours prior, I had viewed this property as a peaceful sanctuary built by my own hard work. Now, I saw the reinforced glass and the isolated location for what they truly were. It was a beautifully constructed, highly expensive isolation chamber. I sat in the idling car for 5 full minutes, closing my eyes and physically forcing my facial muscles to relax. I practiced the exhausted, grateful smile of a dedicated corporate wife returning to her loving, supportive partner. I opened the heavy front door and stepped inside. Julian was waiting in the living room, wearing a soft cashmere sweater, reading a book by the glowing fireplace. He looked up, his eyes crinkling with that trademark, sickeningly sweet affection. I walked straight into his arms, pressing my face into his chest, inhaling the deeply familiar scent of cedar and expensive cologne. My heart was a block of absolute ice, a frozen stone beating in my chest, but I managed to let out a long, weary sigh. I told him the server array took hours to rebuild, kissing him gently on the jawline. He stroked my hair, whispering that I worked entirely too hard and that he would always be there to protect me. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to drive a heavy kitchen knife through his ribs right then and there. From that exact second forward, my entire perspective shifted. I was no longer a participant in a loving marriage. I was a senior analyst evaluating a deeply corrupted biological system. I began to observe Julian with the cold, clinical detachment of an engineer tracking a fatal software bug. Suddenly, the invisible architecture of his control became glaringly obvious. I noticed that he was fiercely territorial about preparing our evening tea, always insisting on bringing me a steaming mug while I worked late on my laptop, standing over me to ensure I drank every last drop. I observed the subtle, insidious ways he isolated me from my support network. When my college friend invited me for brunch on Sunday, Julian gently rubbed my shoulders and suggested I cancel, convincing me I looked far too exhausted and needed a weekend of pure rest with him. His manipulation was seamless, executed with surgical precision. It was terrifyingly brilliant. The next morning brought the ultimate test of my acting abilities. We stood in the sunlit kitchen. Julian poured me a glass of filtered water and handed me the daily assortment of custom-blended vitamin capsules. He watched me with those warm, expectant eyes. I placed the pills in my mouth, took a large gulp of water, and swallowed loudly, expertly maneuvering my tongue to tuck the capsules deep into the pocket of my cheek. I smiled, kissed him goodbye, and walked out to my car. The moment the vehicle doors locked and I was out of his line of sight, I violently spat the partially dissolved capsules into a tissue. Within 48 hours of ceasing the medication, the heavy, suffocating fog that had plagued my mind for the last 6 months began to rapidly evaporate. The persistent, dull headaches vanished completely. The terrifying moments of mild auditory hallucinations, where I thought I heard indistinct whispers in the empty hallway at night, never returned. The mental clarity was both liberating and deeply horrifying. I realized just how incredibly close I had been to the edge of the psychological abyss they had designed for me. But I could not let them know the poison was gone. I had to become the perfect, compliant victim. I leaned heavily into the role of a woman whose mind was actively unraveling under the crushing weight of corporate pressure. I started leaving my car keys inside the refrigerator. I intentionally burned dinner. Staring blankly at the smoke alarm, I would randomly burst into tears in the middle of a casual conversation, apologizing frantically to Julian for my sudden, inexplicable lack of emotional control. He would hold me, soothing me with empty promises, while I could practically feel his internal sadistic satisfaction radiating against my skin. To solidify the illusion of my total breakdown, I scheduled an emergency phone consultation with Beatrice. I sat in my locked car during my lunch break, clutching the steering wheel, intentionally hyperventilating and crying hysterically into the receiver. I begged her for help, sobbing that I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, that my memory was failing entirely, and that I was terrified of losing my career and my mind. Beatrice's voice flowed through the speaker, dripping with maternal concern and professional empathy. She told me to breathe, to trust my wonderful husband, and to lean on Julian entirely during this difficult psychological transition. I thanked her profusely, ended the call, and instantly wiped the fake tears from my perfectly dry face. The performance was flawless. They were completely convinced that their toxic operation was proceeding exactly on schedule. With the decoy firmly in place, I moved aggressively to the offensive. During my afternoon break at the Lumina Aerospace campus, I bypassed the standard network and accessed a completely secure, encrypted terminal in the basement server room. I used an untraceable burner phone to contact a man named Marcus Vance. Marcus was a highly decorated former Federal Bureau of Investigation agent who had spent 15 years hunting down complex financial fraud rings before retiring into private investigative practice. I gave him the minimal details, immediately wired a retainer fee of $25,000 from a hidden offshore account I had maintained since before I ever met Julian, and gave him their names. 72 hours later, Marcus called me back on the secure line. His voice was gravelly and entirely devoid of emotion. He told me that Julian and Beatrice were not their real names, but merely the latest aliases in a long, highly orchestrated, and immensely profitable grift. Marcus had bypassed federal firewalls, pulled their classified background files, and uncovered a devastating pattern of destruction. They had successfully executed this exact same psychological warfare campaign 2 times before. Operating in 2 entirely different states, the first target was a highly successful commercial real estate developer in Oregon. The second was a brilliant tech startup founder in Texas. Both of those fiercely independent women were currently locked away in state-run psychiatric facilities, heavily medicated and legally stripped of their basic human autonomy, while their devoted husbands had quietly liquidated their entire estates and vanished into the wind. I was simply target number 3. Marcus paused, asking me if I wanted to take this massive file of evidence directly to the authorities and press immediate federal charges. I looked at the dark screen of the encrypted phone, observing the reflection of my cold, unblinking eyes staring back at me. Handing them over to the police would only result in a comfortable cell for corporate fraud. That was utterly insufficient. I did not want legal justice. I wanted total, absolute annihilation. I told Marcus to pack his bags and fly to California immediately. The prey was done hiding, and it was time to build a cage of my own. Julian was accelerating the timeline. The invisible clock ticking above my head was speeding up. One rainy Tuesday evening, he sat me down on our plush velvet living room sofa, taking both of my hands in his. He looked deeply into my eyes, delivering a masterclass performance of agonizing, helpless sorrow. He spoke in soft, soothing tones, suggesting that I sign a temporary medical and financial power of attorney. He pitched the legal document not as a surrender of my rights, but as a protective shield. He claimed he desperately wanted to handle the aggressive human resources department at Lumina Aerospace and manage our complex mortgage payments so I could focus entirely on resting my overworked, deteriorating mind. I stared back at him, forcing my lower lip to tremble slightly. I squeezed his warm hands, allowing 2 perfect, heavy tears to roll down my cheeks. I whispered how incredibly grateful I was to have a husband who loved me enough to carry my burdens. I told him I would absolutely sign the documents, but I wanted it to mean something special. I suggested we finalize everything over a romantic anniversary dinner next Friday evening. Julian reached out and softly wiped away my tears, kissing my forehead. Behind his empathetic mask, I saw his eyes flash with a predatory, exhilarating triumph. He agreed instantly. The moment he left the house the following morning to meet with his imaginary consulting clients, I went straight to work. I had secretly smuggled out several highly classified, pinhead-sized microcameras from the Advanced Optics Laboratory at the Lumina Aerospace campus. These were not commercially available security toys. They were military-grade surveillance components designed for stealth drone operations. I meticulously embedded the tiny lenses into the intricate dark woodwork of the kitchen cabinets and deep into the stone grout of the living room fireplace. They were entirely invisible to the naked eye, wired directly into a secure encrypted cloud server that Marcus Vance was monitoring remotely. Every single square inch of the main floor was now under ultra-high-definition surveillance, with studio-quality audio reception. The hunters were about to perform their final act on my private, heavily monitored stage. While I handled the hardware, Marcus executed a devastating legal assassination. Working in the absolute shadows, he connected me with a ruthless, high-tier corporate attorney who specialized in building impenetrable financial fortresses. Over an encrypted video call that lasted less than 2 hours, I signed the establishment documents for an irrevocable blind trust. In one swift, legally binding motion, I transferred 100% of the ownership of the mountain cabin, the entirety of my massive stock portfolio, and all of my proprietary technology patents directly into the trust. I willingly surrendered all direct control to a faceless board of corporate trustees. By doing so, I effectively impoverished myself on paper. That power of attorney document Julian was so desperate for me to sign next Friday was now entirely, irrevocably, worthless. It gave him legal control over an estate that simply no longer existed. He was aiming a loaded gun at a ghost. But taking Julian down alone was not enough. I needed Beatrice in the room. I needed the mastermind who prescribed the poison to be caught in the exact same blast radius, to lure her out. I started carelessly leaving heavily forged psychiatric self-evaluations lying exposed on my home office desk. I documented terrifying auditory hallucinations, massive daily memory blackouts, and severe paranoid delusions. Julian found them, just as I intended. I knew a seasoned con artist would panic at the extreme severity of my fake symptoms. He would absolutely insist that a licensed medical professional be present to evaluate my competency when I signed the legal transfer, just to cover his tracks in case a probate judge ever reviewed the paperwork. Exactly as I calculated, Julian gently suggested that Beatrice join us for dessert on Friday night to check in on my progress and act as a formal, objective medical witness to the power of attorney signature. I smiled weakly and agreed enthusiastically, praising him for being so incredibly thoughtful. The board was now perfectly set. Every single piece was locked into its fatal position in the dark. To Julian and Beatrice, the game was moving exactly according to their flawless, time-tested script. They were entirely convinced that by midnight next Friday, they would possess my fortune, my home, and my sanity. They saw a broken, deteriorating woman ready to hand over the keys to her hard-earned kingdom. What they did not see was the absolute zero-degree hellfire waiting for them behind my tired, compliant smile. Everything in the world looked like Julian was about to win an absolute, unquestionable victory, and that was exactly what I needed him to believe before I burned his entire world to ashes. Friday evening arrived with a heavy, suffocating silence. Outside, the mountain wind had completely died down, leaving the ancient pine forest entirely still. Inside the cabin, the dining room was a portrait of manufactured romance and domestic perfection. A pristine white linen tablecloth was draped flawlessly over the heavy oak dining table. The soft, flickering golden light from two tall beeswax candles cast long, dancing shadows across the polished wooden floor. I stood out of sight in the darkened hallway, holding my breath, staring down at the glowing screen of my secured smartphone. The live feed from the microscopic camera hidden above the kitchen island was running in perfect high definition. Through the digital screen, I watched Julian moving with the graceful, fluid precision of a seasoned predator. He transferred a beautifully roasted tenderloin onto a porcelain serving platter, the rich scent of garlic and rosemary drifting through the air. He wiped his hands on a linen towel, completely unaware of the invisible lens documenting his every breath. He reached for a heavy crystal decanter and poured a deep, ruby-red vintage into two long-stemmed wine glasses. Then, he paused. The kitchen was dead quiet. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored dark jacket, pulled out a small glass vial, and extracted a single, translucent capsule. With a practiced, effortless flick of his thumb, he popped the capsule open and tapped a fine, powdery substance directly into my glass of wine. He gently swirled the crystal stem, watching the lethal poison dissolve into the dark liquid until it was completely untraceable. He smiled. It was a genuine, terrifyingly peaceful smile. I slipped my phone into my pocket and smoothed down the front of my silk dress. I forced my shoulders to slump slightly, adopting the fragile, exhausted posture of a woman barely holding on to reality. I walked into the dining room just as the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the cabin. Julian hurried to answer it, his face instantly transforming back into the concerned, devoted husband. Beatrice stepped over the threshold exactly on schedule. She looked stunning, dressed in a sharp, elegant charcoal gray blazer, a silk scarf perfectly draped around her neck, and smelling faintly of expensive jasmine perfume. Clutched firmly in her manicured hand was a sleek leather briefcase containing the forged legal documents. She walked toward me with her arms outstretched, her face a perfect mask of deep professional sympathy. She gently grasped my cold hands, looking deeply into my eyes, and softly asked how I was holding up this evening. I blinked slowly, letting out a weak, breathy sigh, and told her I was just so incredibly tired and ready for this nightmare to end. We moved to the dining table. The atmosphere was thick, compressed, and heavy, exactly like the static air right before a massive thunderstorm breaks. Every scrape of a wooden chair against the floorboards, every clinking sound of silverware against porcelain, seemed to echo violently in my ears. Julian placed the tainted glass of red wine exactly 2 inches from my right hand. Beatrice did not waste any time with dinner. With practiced grace, she unlatched her briefcase. The sharp, metallic click of the lock sounded like a gun being cocked in the quiet room. She slid a thick stack of legal papers bound by a heavy blue clip across the white linen tablecloth. Julian leaned in close to me. I could smell the familiar cedar scent of his cologne, the scent I used to associate with safety. He gently pushed the papers closer, his warm, strong hand briefly resting on my trembling fingers. He picked up a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen and offered it to me. His voice was an absolute masterclass in psychological manipulation. It was low, rich, dripping with pure devotion and protective warmth. "Sign it, darling," Julian murmured, his eyes locking onto mine with manufactured love. "Let me carry everything from now on. You just need to drink this wine and get a truly good night's sleep." The silence that followed was absolute. It felt as though all the oxygen had been completely drained from the room. I stared down at the crisp white paper. The complex legal jargon blurred together into a sea of black ink. I looked at the golden pen resting in his outstretched palm. Then, I slowly shifted my gaze to the crystal glass of red wine, the dark liquid catching the flickering candlelight, hiding the chemical agent designed to erase my mind. I reached out with a trembling hand, my fingers wrapped around the cold metal of the fountain pen. I lifted it from his palm. I held the sharp tip of the pen suspended exactly 1 inch above the thick black signature line. 1 second passed. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic, soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. 2 seconds. I could hear Julian exhaling slowly, waiting for the ink to permanently seal my fate and hand over my empire. 3 seconds. Beatrice leaned forward ever so slightly in her chair, her eyes fixed hungrily on the nib of the pen, holding her breath. The air grew entirely solid. The tension was stretched to the absolute breaking point. Instead of pressing the ink to the paper, I stopped. My trembling fingers suddenly became perfectly still. The terrified, fragile expression melted off my face like wax held to a flame. I calmly lowered the fountain pen, placing it gently down onto the white tablecloth with a soft, definitive thud. Before Julian could even register the sudden change in my posture, my right hand darted out. I grabbed the crystal stem of the wine glass. In one singular, violent, and explosive motion, I threw the dark red liquid straight across the table. The vintage wine struck Julian directly in the face. The dark liquid splashed violently against his perfectly styled hair, soaked the collar of his crisp white dress shirt, and dripped down his shocked, gaping mouth like fresh blood. He gasped, completely paralyzed, his hands freezing mid-air in absolute shock. Beatrice shrieked sharply, jumping back in her chair as red drops splattered across her pristine, forged legal documents. I did not move. I simply leaned back against the high wooden frame of my dining chair. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for the last 3 years vanished into the thin mountain air. I felt a surge of absolute, freezing power radiate through my veins. The frightened, compliant bird they thought they had caged was dead. I looked him dead in the eyes, my posture entirely relaxed, my voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "Good wine, Julian," I said, my tone as cold and sharp as shattered glass. but I prefer to drink it without the Rohypnol. Julian froze, the red wine dripping from his chin onto his crisp white shirt. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single word of defense, before either of them could even attempt to construct a lie. A deafening crash shattered the silence of the cabin. The heavy wooden front door was violently kicked open, slamming against the interior wall with the force of a gunshot. Detective Marcus Vance strode into the dining room, moving with the heavy, undeniable authority of a seasoned predator. Flanking him were 3 heavily armed federal agents, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the elegant dinner setting. I calmly reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and pressed a single button. Instantly, the massive 85-inch television screen in the adjacent living room flared to life. The high-definition, 4K resolution video feed from the hidden kitchen camera played for the entire room to see. There was Julian, towering over my crystal glass in crystal-clear detail, slipping the translucent capsule into the vintage red wine. Synchronized with the video was the audio from Arthur's ancient radio receiver, booming through the surround sound speakers. Julian and Beatrice's own voices filled the cabin, explicitly detailing their monstrous plan to poison my brain and liquidate my life. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," one of the federal agents barked. Stepping toward Beatrice, he violently pulled her arms backward, the cold steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around her delicate wrists. "You are under arrest for federal medical license forgery, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit manslaughter." Beatrice, the sophisticated therapist who had manipulated my mind for months, was entirely broken. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her skin as pale and lifeless as a corpse. She trembled violently, her expensive designer briefcase falling to the floor, scattering the useless forged documents across the hardwood. Marcus stepped forward, stopping right in front of Julian. He slammed a thick manila folder onto the ruined white linen tablecloth. "That is the official documentation of an irrevocable blind trust, Julian," Marcus growled, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Every single asset, the patents, the stocks, this beautiful mountain property, all of it was transferred completely out of her name 48 hours ago. You hold the legal rights to absolutely nothing, and that fake marriage certificate you procured from Nevada, it is currently sitting in an evidence locker as the cornerstone of a massive federal identity theft investigation." The glamorous, confident facade Julian had maintained for 3 years instantly vaporized. The charming independent consultant died right there on my dining room floor, revealing the pathetic, cowardly parasite underneath. His knees buckled. He collapsed onto the hardwood, crawling toward my chair, sobbing uncontrollably, the wine on his face mixed with genuine tears of terror. He reached out with trembling hands, clutching desperately at the hem of my silk dress. "Avery, please," he wailed, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "Please, I swear to God I really loved you. The money got out of hand. Beatrice forced me into the final stages, but what we had was real. Do not let them take me." I stood up, stepping back so his filthy hands slipped off my dress. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical disgust. I leaned down slowly, bringing my face just inches from his ear. "You plan to lock me in a psychiatric ward," I whispered, my voice perfectly steady and sharp as a scalpel. "But a federal prison is a much better cage for you." I turned my back and walked away as the agents hauled him roughly to his feet, reading him his Miranda rights while he continued to sob hysterically as they dragged him out the front door. The next morning, the cabin was finally empty. I stood alone on the expansive wooden deck, the sun rising over the towering pine trees, casting a brilliant golden light across the valley. I wrapped both hands around a steaming mug of hot coffee, breathing in the crisp, freezing mountain air. The suffocating fog that had clouded my mind for months was completely gone. I smiled, taking a deep, satisfying sip of the dark roast. Sometimes, you have to let the fire completely burn away the illusion, just so you can keep the solid ground that truly belongs to you. Thank you all so incredibly much for listening to this story today. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story empowering and want to hear more, please consider helping us keep the channel alive by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon. Over there, you can listen to our absolute best, highly detailed, exclusive true stories that are simply too intense to publish on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code right here on the screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the description box and the pinned comment below. Thank you again. Stay safe, and remember to always trust your instincts.